You are late again! This is unacceptable. Look at your shoulder, you are making it worse.
I am trying.
Try harder or leave.
The autumn of 1815 had settled over Thistledown Park with an early chill. Not the gentle kind that painted the trees in beautiful colors and invited leisurely walks through the countryside. No, this was the sort of cold that crept into your bones before sunrise. The stable yard froze overnight into uneven ridges of hardened mud, only to soften again by noon into thick earth that clung stubbornly to boots and wagon wheels alike. Marianne Coe had stopped expecting mercy from the seasons years ago. Nature, she'd learned, was rarely concerned with comfort, especially not for people who earned their living outdoors. And lately, life had become even less forgiving. Ever since the old master of Thistledown Park had died without a direct heir, the entire estate had been suspended in uncertainty. Lawyers in London argued over wills. Solicitors exchanged endless letters. Distant relatives surfaced from nowhere, each convinced fate or entitlement had chosen them to inherit. Meanwhile, the people actually living and working on the estate simply carried on. Someone still had to feed the horses. Someone still had to mend the fences. Someone still had to make certain the tenants had somewhere to turn when roofs leaked or livestock wandered. That responsibility had fallen almost entirely on Marianne's father. Edgar Coe had served as steward for years, and though he wore his responsibilities with quiet dignity, the past 4 months had aged him more than the previous 10. The household staff hadn't received a full quarter's wages since the funeral. 2 experienced stable hands had left in the spring for estates that actually paid on time. Those who remained simply worked harder, including Marianne. She had been awake long before dawn that morning, lantern in hand, moving from stall to stall with practiced confidence. Each horse received a reassuring pat across the neck, fresh hay, fresh water, a quick inspection of every hoof. It wasn't merely work. The stables had been her world since childhood. She understood horses better than most people. Horses never lied. People often did. Outside, pale morning light struggled through heavy clouds as she carried a saddle toward the largest carriage horse. Then she stopped. Someone else had reached the horse. The newest stable hand, Jack Pell. He had arrived barely 2 weeks earlier with little more than a travel bag, respectable references from a Yorkshire estate, and an eagerness to work that her father hadn't been in a position to question too closely. They desperately needed another pair of hands. That had been enough. From the beginning, Marianne had noticed little things about him. He handled nervous horses with remarkable patience. He never shouted, never struck an animal in frustration. And, unlike most men in the servants' hall, he rarely joined the louder conversations. He listened far more than he spoke. There was something different, not suspicious, simply difficult to place. She might never have thought much more about him had she not watched him struggle to lift an ordinary saddle. It wasn't the saddle, it was his arm. For the briefest moment, pain flashed across his face before disappearing behind a carefully controlled expression. Too quickly for most people to notice, not quickly enough for Marianne. She crossed the yard without hesitation. "You hurt?" Jack didn't even look at her. "I'm well enough." She folded her arms. "No." He finally glanced over. I'm sorry. You're gray in the face." She pointed toward the saddle he was still holding awkwardly. "And you're carrying that saddle like it weighs twice what it actually does." He shifted his grip instinctively. The movement alone told her everything. She sighed. "That's not a man who's well. It's a man pretending to be." Jack gave the faintest smile. "I assure you, Miss Coe, no." She stepped forward before he could finish, carefully placing her own hands beneath the saddle. "Let go. I can manage. I didn't ask whether you could." For a second, neither of them moved. Then, almost reluctantly, he surrendered the weight. Marianne lifted the saddle with effortless familiarity and settled it across the horse. The horse barely twitched. She adjusted the blanket beneath it with practiced hands before turning back toward Jack. Now that she wasn't distracted, she could see it clearly. He was favoring his right shoulder, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to mention, but enough. What happened? A fall. When? A few days ago. A few. He shrugged. Something like that. She stared at him, then laughed, not because anything was amusing, because she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "A few days? You've been working through it all week." "It isn't serious." "It isn't serious?" Her eyebrows climbed. "You can barely lift a saddle." "I lifted it." "Barely. I managed." "You grimaced." "I did not." "You absolutely did." He opened his mouth, closed it again. Marianne nodded triumphantly. "Exactly." Jack looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "I've had worse." "I'm sure you have." She folded her arms again. "That doesn't make this sensible." "It's a working injury." "So?" "Working men carry injuries." Marianne's expression hardened. "Working men who intend to keep working 10 years from now know when to rest." Jack said nothing. She stepped closer. "You keep pretending that shoulder isn't injured, and eventually it won't heal. You'll damage it properly. And then? Who's going to employ a stable hand with one useless arm?" Silence settled between them. Only the soft breathing of horses filled the yard. Jack studied her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You speak your mind rather freely." "I do." "To someone you've known less than a fortnight?" She shrugged. "I'd say exactly the same thing if I'd known you 10 years. "You would?" "Of course." She gestured toward the horses behind them. "If one of them strained a tendon, would you keep riding it?" "No. You'd rest it. Naturally." "Why?" "So it heals." She nodded. Neither looked away. Something had quietly changed between them. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough to notice. Enough to remember. The peace lasted another week. Then a carriage arrived. Marianne heard it before she saw it. The wheels rolled sharply across the gravel drive, too elegant for ordinary visitors, too confident. She stepped outside the stable just as the black carriage stopped before the front entrance. A liveried servant opened the door. A gentleman descended, well-dressed, perfectly tailored, expensively confident. The sort of man who seemed to believe every building naturally belonged to him. Marianne recognized the expression immediately. She disliked it just as quickly. Her father appeared moments later, summoned by the butler. The conversation on the front steps was brief, formal. Neither man smiled. When Edgar Coe finally returned toward the stable yard, exhaustion seemed to have settled another inch deeper into his shoulders. Marianne met him halfway. "Who was that?" Her father sighed. "Reginald Ashby." The cousin? The very one. The man challenging the inheritance. He nodded. He intends to inspect the estate himself. On whose authority? His own imagination, apparently. Marianne frowned. Surely he can't simply arrive and begin making demands. He believes he can. And until the courts settle matters, he intends to make himself extremely difficult. She glanced toward the great house. What exactly does he want? What every disappointed heir wants. Her father's smile was weary. Proof. Proof that this estate has been mismanaged, so he can argue the rightful owner has neglected it, and perhaps persuade the courts the inheritance ought to be reconsidered. Marianne folded her arms. That's absurd. It is, but absurd arguments still cost money to defeat. She looked at her father carefully. You've done nothing wrong. I know. Do you? He smiled sadly. I've tried my best. Sometimes, he glanced toward the house, trying your best isn't what people remember. She reached for his arm. They'll remember, I promise. That evening, long after supper, Marianne found herself thinking about the mysterious new stable hand, the quiet cavalryman, the careful horseman, the strangely educated laborer. There was something about him, something that didn't quite fit. Not enough to accuse, not enough to explain, just enough. Enough that, for the first time, she caught herself wondering whether Jack Pell arrived at Thistledown Park carrying far more than one injured shoulder. If you're starting to suspect Jack knows much more about this estate than he's admitting, comment "the entail" below. And don't forget to subscribe, because in the next part, Reginald Ashby begins asking questions that force Jack closer to revealing the truth he's been hiding from everyone. The following morning, Reginald Ashby wasted no time making his presence known. He appeared throughout Thistledown Park as though he already owned every acre of it. He questioned gardeners while they trimmed hedges, interrupted stable boys carrying feed, stopped tenant farmers on the lane simply to ask how the estate was being managed. He smiled while doing it, always smiled. But Marianne had met enough people in her life to know the difference between kindness and calculation. Ashby's smile never reached his eyes. It lingered only on his lips, like another piece of expensive clothing. By midday, word had already spread among the servants. He'd asked how often wages were delayed, whether repairs had been neglected, whether tenants were dissatisfied, whether livestock had been sold unusually cheaply. Little questions, harmless on their own, dangerous when collected together. Marianne understood exactly what he was doing. He wasn't looking for truth. He was gathering ammunition. She first spoke to him properly that afternoon. She had been checking harnesses outside the stable when Ashby wandered into the yard with leisurely confidence, glancing around as though inspecting livestock at market. His polished boots collected barely a trace of mud, a remarkable achievement considering the condition of the ground. He looked Marianne over briefly before speaking. "You're the stable's daughter." She met his gaze evenly. "I am. I've heard your father has managed matters here these past several months." "He has." Ashby nodded thoughtfully. "So unfortunate." Marianne waited. He continued, "I've spoken to several tenants. They seem concerned." "About what?" "The delays, the uncertainty, the wages." He sighed theatrically. "I confess, the condition of the estate troubles me." Marianne didn't answer immediately. Instead, she carefully hung the harness she had been cleaning. Only then did she turn back toward him. "My father has done everything possible." Ashby smiled again. I'm sure he believes that. No, Marianne corrected quietly. I know it. His eyebrows lifted. You're remarkably confident. I've watched him work. He rises before dawn. He retires long after everyone else. He answers letters, settles disputes, visits tenants, balances accounts, and somehow manages all of it while London takes months to release the money this estate actually needs. Ashby's pleasant smile became thinner. Money delays don't explain everything. They explain quite a great deal. He folded his hands behind his back. You speak boldly, for a stable's daughter. Marianne's expression never changed. I speak plainly. I've found plain speaking considerably more useful than polite pretending. For a moment, neither moved. The stable yard had become strangely quiet. Even nearby workers seemed suddenly fascinated by their own tasks. Ashby's eyes cooled noticeably. I should advise greater caution. Why? She genuinely sounded curious. Because circumstances change. Perhaps. She nodded once, but honesty shouldn't. Something flashed across his face. Not anger, not quite. More like irritation at finding himself unable to intimidate someone he considered beneath notice. He offered a stiff nod. We shall speak again. I'm sure we shall. He walked away without another word. Only after he disappeared around the corner did Marianne allow herself a slow breath. She disliked the man immensely, and she suspected the feeling was entirely mutual.
Exactly. Then she tilted her head slightly. So, explain something to me. Why do we show more sense to injured horses than injured people? Jack blinked. For the first time, he genuinely didn't seem to have an answer. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, quietly, warmly. I've been compared to many things over the years. I don't believe anyone has ever compared me favorably to a horse. Marianne smiled despite herself. I wasn't comparing you favorably. I merely said we ought to treat you with at least as much common sense. His smile widened. That's considerably less flattering. It was never intended to flatter you. Another pause. Another small smile. Something surprisingly comfortable settled between them. She broke it first. Sit. He frowned. What? On the mounting block. I don't think that's necessary. I wasn't asking. I'll fetch liniment. And before you argue, she pointed a finger directly at him. Remember that you're in my father's stables, and in my father's stables, you'll do exactly as you're told. She turned before he could object, walking briskly toward the tack room. Behind her, she heard it, the wooden creak of the mounting block. He'd sat down, without another word. A tiny smile touched her lips. Stubborn man. 4 months earlier, hundreds of miles away, another man had received news capable of changing an entire life. Julian Thorne hadn't celebrated when the solicitor arrived. Most men would have. After all, he had just inherited one of the finest estates in Wiltshire. Land, income, responsibility, status. Yet none of it brought him joy. His own father had died only months before. Grief still lingered like a shadow that refused to leave. The inheritance felt less like a blessing and more like another weight placed upon shoulders already carrying too much. He had scarcely known the cousin whose death had placed Thistledown Park into his possession. They'd met perhaps twice, nothing more. Still, the law was clear. The entail left no room for argument. The estate belonged to him. At least, according to the lawyers. Unfortunately, not everyone agreed. Letters had already begun arriving, some polite, others considerably less so.
One name appeared again and again: Reginald Ashby, a distant relation, a man utterly convinced the inheritance ought to have been his. His complaints became increasingly pointed, increasingly hostile. He questioned the legality of the entail, suggested irregularities, hinted at court challenges. Julian read every letter carefully, not because he believed Ashby was right, but because he had learned something valuable over the years. Whenever money changed hands, people changed with it. Instead of announcing himself immediately as the new master, he made an unusual decision. He would visit the estate, unnoticed. No title, no servants, no introductions, just another working man. He wanted to know the truth, not polished reports, not flattering letters, the truth. How was the steward managing? Were the tenants being treated fairly? Was the estate truly struggling, or were ambitious relatives simply manufacturing problems? So Julian became Jack Pell, forged references from a Yorkshire estate, simple clothing, calloused hands, a false name. Within a week, he was mucking stalls alongside men who had absolutely no idea they were working beside the owner of the estate. It had been an excellent plan, until one determined steward's daughter noticed a shoulder injury he'd hoped no one would ever see. And somehow, after only 2 weeks, he found himself looking forward each morning to being thoroughly scolded by her. If you're already wondering why Jack seems too educated to be an ordinary stable hand, comment the shoulder below. And don't forget to subscribe, because what Marianne just did, without realizing it, is about to change both of their lives forever. The liniment became part of our mornings, not because the shoulder still demanded constant attention, though it certainly wasn't fully healed. It became routine because neither of them found a reason to stop. Every morning, before the heavier work began, Marianne insisted on inspecting Jack's shoulder herself. Every morning, he protested, and every morning she ignored him. By the 5th day, the argument had become almost ceremonial. Hold still. I'm perfectly capable of standing without supervision. I wasn't worried about your standing. She uncorked the small bottle of liniment. I was worried about your remarkable talent for making injuries worse. I've done nothing reckless. You tried lifting 2 feed sacks yesterday. They weren't especially heavy. They were each heavier than you should have been carrying. They reached the loft. Yes, she looked up at him, and then you couldn't lift your arm properly for the next hour. Jack opened his mouth, thought better of whatever he intended to say. Marianne smiled with quiet satisfaction. I thought so. She dipped her fingers into the liniment before gently working it into the muscles around his shoulder. Unlike the first morning, he no longer flinched. The swelling had almost disappeared. Most of the bruising had faded from deep violet into pale shades of yellow. Progress. Slow, steady progress. There, she stepped back after several moments. Another week, perhaps less, if, she emphasized the word, you stop trying to prove you're indestructible. I've been remarkably obedient. You can't help smiling. Under constant complaint. I believe I've earned the right to complain. No. She began wrapping the familiar strip of linen around his shoulder. You've earned the privilege of remaining employed. He laughed softly. I see. My opinions are optional. My obedience isn't. Precisely. She tied the knot with practiced efficiency. For a brief second, neither of them moved. The stable around them had already begun waking. Someone carried buckets across the courtyard. A horse snorted somewhere behind them. The scent of fresh hay drifted through the cool morning air. Simple sounds, ordinary sounds, yet somehow neither seemed eager to end the moment. Finally, Marianne broke the silence. "You're an odd sort of stable hand." Jack looked amused. "Only odd?"
Neither looked away. Something had quietly changed between them. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough to notice, enough to remember. The peace lasted another week. Then, a carriage arrived. Marianne heard it before she saw it. The wheels rolled sharply across the gravel drive, too elegant for ordinary visitors, too confident. She stepped outside the stable just as the black carriage stopped before the front entrance. A liveried servant opened the door. A gentleman descended, well-dressed, perfectly tailored, expensively confident. The sort of man who seemed to believe every building naturally belonged to him. Marianne recognized the expression immediately. She disliked it just as quickly. Her father appeared moments later, summoned by the butler. The conversation on the front steps was brief, formal. Neither man smiled. When Edgar Coe finally returned toward the stable yard, exhaustion seemed to have settled another inch deeper into his shoulders. Marianne met him halfway. "Who was that?" Her father sighed. "Reginald Ashby." "The cousin?" "The very one." "The man challenging the inheritance?" He nodded. "He intends to inspect the estate himself." "On whose authority?" "His own imagination, apparently." Marianne frowned. "Surely he can't simply arrive and begin making demands." "He believes he can." "And until the courts settle matters?" "He intends to make himself extremely difficult." She glanced toward the great house. "What exactly does he want?" "What every disappointed heir wants." Her father's smile was weary. "Proof. Proof that this estate has been mismanaged. So he can argue the rightful owner has neglected it."
"A great deal." His voice was calm, gentle. "There is." She felt her stomach tighten. "I hoped," he continued quietly, "to tell you myself." "What is it?" He looked toward the house, then back at her. "I think you're about to find out." Without another word, he turned and walked toward the manor, leaving Marianne standing motionless in the stable yard, watching him disappear through the front doors with the unmistakable feeling that the man she'd spent weeks believing she knew had never truly been Jack Pell at all. If you've already guessed who Jack really is, comment "the drawing room" below. And don't forget to subscribe, because in the next part, Marianne walks into one room and discovers the quiet stable hand she's been bandaging every morning is someone she never could have imagined. Jack barely remembered crossing the entrance hall. His steps were steady, measured. Years of discipline made certain of that. Inside, he was anything but steady. This was the moment he had delayed for days, the moment he'd convinced himself he could choose. Now, the choice had been made for him. Mr. Hollis waited in the drawing room, as immaculate as ever. His leather portfolio rested neatly beneath one arm, while two footmen stood discreetly near the door. Edgar Coe was already there. He looked understandably confused. Marianne entered only seconds later. She glanced first at her father, then at the solicitor, finally at Jack. No one spoke. The silence stretched just long enough for everyone to feel it. Mr. Hollis finally cleared his throat. "Mr. Coe." Edgar inclined his head. "Mr. Hollis, I must apologize." "For what?" "For the unusual manner in which this introduction has become necessary." Edgar frowned. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "You soon shall." The solicitor turned toward Jack. For a heartbeat, neither man moved. Then Jack quietly removed the worn work gloves from his hands, laid them carefully on the table, straightened his coat, and something changed. It wasn't the clothing. He still wore the same plain garments he'd worked in all morning. It wasn't even his posture, not entirely. It was simply the way he stood. The quiet confidence Marianne had noticed from the beginning suddenly made perfect sense. He no longer looked like a man borrowing authority. He looked like someone who had carried it his whole life. Mr. Hollis spoke clearly. "This gentleman is not Jack Pell." The room became impossibly still. "He is—" The solicitor paused just briefly. "Julian Thorne, the Earl of Ravensworth, and the lawful owner of Thistledown Park." Silence. Complete silence. Marianne simply stared. Her mind rejected the words before it even attempted to understand them. The Earl? No, that wasn't possible. Jack? Jack mucked stalls. Jack cleaned tack. Jack complained every morning when she insisted on treating his shoulder. Jack carried feed sacks. Jack laughed when she compared him unfavorably to a horse. Earls didn't do those things. Surely they didn't. Her eyes drifted slowly toward him, toward Julian. For the first time since she'd met him, she truly looked, not at the clothes, at the man. The calm confidence, the measured breathing, the unmistakable bearing she'd never been able to explain. She remembered every conversation they'd shared, every strangely thoughtful answer, every careful word, every moment she'd caught herself wondering, "You don't sound like a stable hand," because he never had. Her voice emerged almost as a whisper. "You." Julian met her eyes. Yes. Nothing more. Just yes. Not defensive, not proud, simply truthful. Edgar Coe recovered first. His face had gone almost entirely pale. "My lord." He took one uncertain step forward. "I had no idea." Julian shook his head immediately. "I know. If I have failed, you have not." The answer came firmly, without hesitation. "You have failed in nothing." Mr. Coe looked genuinely bewildered. Julian continued, "I came here intending to observe, quietly. I wished to learn how this estate truly functioned, not how reports described it. I wanted to see the work, the people, the tenants, the accounts. I wanted the truth." He looked directly at Edgar. "And you, I found it. You have managed this estate with honesty, with diligence, and under circumstances far more difficult than London ever appreciated." The older man's shoulders sagged slightly, not from exhaustion this time, from relief. Julian smiled. "The delayed wages, the repairs, the uncertainty, none of those failures belong to you. They belong to bureaucracy. You merely carried burdens that should never have rested on one man's shoulders." Edgar swallowed hard. "Thank you, my lord." "No," Julian answered quietly. "Thank you." Only then did he turn back toward Marianne. She still hadn't moved. She wasn't angry, not yet. She simply looked overwhelmed. Finally, she found her voice. "You lied." Julian accepted the words without argument. "I did. You watched me," she almost laughed in disbelief, "lecture you, repeatedly." "I did. You let me tell you what to do." "I did. You ordered me to sit on a mounting block." "You certainly did. I compared you to a horse." His mouth curved into the smallest smile. "More than once. I called you stubborn. You were correct. I accused you of foolish pride. You were correct again." She stared at him another long moment, then shook her head slowly. "I bandaged your shoulder every morning." "You did. And all that time you were the Earl of Ravensworth." "I was." She folded her arms instinctively. "You could have told me." "I know. So why didn't you?" Julian hesitated. For the first time since entering the room, he genuinely struggled for an answer. "When I first arrived, I intended to reveal myself within a few days." "What changed?" He looked directly at her. "You." That evening, she found Jack alone inside the tack room. Rain threatened again outside, leaving the building wrapped in soft grey light. He sat repairing an old bridle, his sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. Without looking up, he said, "You've had an unpleasant day." Marianne blinked. "Was it that obvious? You've been polishing the same buckle for 5 minutes." She looked down. He was right. She laughed softly. "I hadn't noticed. You rarely stop moving. When you do, something's bothering you." She sat opposite him. For a few moments, neither spoke. Finally, she sighed. "Ashby." Jack nodded slowly. "I thought so much. He's impossible." "What happened?" He questioned everyone. The gardeners, the tenants, my father, the stable boys. "He isn't interested in helping. He's hunting for faults." Jack set the bridle aside. "And did he find any?" "No," she answered firmly, "because there aren't any." She leaned forward slightly. "My father has held this estate together almost single-handedly, without proper funding, without clear instructions, without even meeting the man who supposedly owns it." Her frustration had been building all day. Now it spilled out naturally. "Can you imagine that?" She looked toward the window. 4 months, not a single visit, not one letter beyond whatever the solicitors choose to send. The owner may as well live on the moon. Jack remained very still. She continued, "Meanwhile, my father carries every burden, and now this Ashby fellow arrives, behaving as though everyone here has failed him personally." She shook her head. "I don't understand men like that." Jack spoke carefully. "Perhaps. The owner has reasons." She sighed. "So everyone keeps saying. He may. He inherited unexpectedly. He could be investigating matters quietly. He may wish to understand the estate before announcing himself." Marianne smiled faintly. "You're remarkably generous toward someone you've never met." Jack returned a small smile. "Perhaps. But I prefer giving people the benefit of the doubt." "I usually do too," she admitted. "But after 4 months," she looked toward the window, "patience becomes difficult." Jack watched her silently, then asked, "If he did arrive, what would you say to him?" She laughed. "Oh, I'd probably scold him." "You would?" "Absolutely. For disappearing, for leaving everyone guessing, for allowing my father to shoulder all this uncertainty." She shrugged. "If he disliked hearing the truth, That would hardly be my concern. Jack lowered his eyes briefly. A smile threatened. You truly would. I certainly would. You wouldn't hesitate because he happened to be an earl? She looked genuinely puzzled. Why would I? An earl still possesses ears. If no one tells him when he's behaving foolishly, how will he ever improve? Jack laughed, a real laugh this time, warm enough to fill the room. Marianne smiled, without quite understanding why his amusement pleased her so much. Their conversation drifted elsewhere after that, to horses, to weather, to repairs that still needed doing before winter. Yet Jack heard almost none of it. Her earlier words lingered. If no one tells him when he's behaving foolishly, how will he ever improve? How many years had passed, he wondered, since anyone had spoken to him that honestly, not because they expected favor, not because they sought advantage, simply because they believed it needed saying. The answer unsettled him. Far too many. The next several days only deepened the difficulty. Reginald Ashby remained everywhere, watching, questioning, recording notes. One afternoon, Jack spotted him examining estate ledgers alongside a visiting solicitor. Another morning, he overheard Ashby suggesting repairs had been neglected. Every accusation seemed carefully chosen, never outrageous, always plausible enough to create doubt. Jack spent each evening reviewing what he'd observed, quietly confirming something he'd begun suspecting almost immediately after arriving. Edgar Coe wasn't merely competent, he was exceptional. Without him, the estate might genuinely have collapsed during those uncertain months. The accounts were honest, the tenants respected him. Even delayed wages didn't destroy loyalty. Why? Because Edgar never lied to them. He'd explained every delay, shared every difficulty, done his best. People remembered effort. Julian admired that, more than he expected. Late one evening, he stood alone outside the stable. The grounds were silent beneath a sky crowded with stars. Footsteps approached behind him. Marianne. She carried a lantern. I thought I'd find you here. He smiled faintly. I often come outside before bed. She joined him beside the paddock fence. The horses shifted quietly in the darkness. Neither spoke for some time. Then Marianne broke the silence. Do you ever feel, she searched for the words, something's about to happen? Jack glanced toward her. What sort of something? I don't know. She laughed softly. That's rather the problem. She looked toward the house. Everything feels ready, as though we've all been waiting. For what? She shook her head. I wish I knew. Jack's heart tightened, because he knew exactly what she was sensing. His deception could not continue much longer. Every day made it harder. Every conversation, every shared smile, every morning she wrapped linen around his shoulder. He had come intending to inspect an estate, nothing more. Instead, he had found himself living honestly for years, ironically, under an entirely false name. The following afternoon changed everything. A carriage rolled into the drive, not Ashby's, not another tenant, a solicitor, Mr. Hollis. Julian recognized him immediately. Their eyes met only briefly. That was enough. The message was unmistakable. It was time. No more delays, no more disguises. The butler crossed the courtyard. Jack. He looked up. Yes? The steward requires your presence, immediately. Marianne frowned. For what? The butler hesitated. The solicitor insisted. Jack drew one slow breath, then nodded. I'll come. Marianne looked between them. Confusion crept across her face. Jack, she asked quietly, is there something you haven't told me? He met her eyes, long enough that she immediately knew the answer. Yes.
Marianne blinked. What does that mean? It means he chose every word carefully. You spoke to me honestly. You treated me as a man, not as a title. You never measured your words. You never flattered me. You simply told me when I was being an idiot. A tiny smile appeared despite herself. I may have used different wording, only slightly. He smiled too. I discovered something. What? I liked being Jack Pell. The confession surprised everyone, including himself. I liked waking each morning knowing no one expected anything except honest work. I liked conversations that weren't shaped by rank. I liked earning respect instead of inheriting it. His eyes softened, and he looked only at Marianne now. I found myself unwilling to lose the way you looked at me. She frowned slightly. I don't understand. You saw a stable hand. I did. You never cared whether he possessed wealth or title or influence. You cared whether he was healing properly. A faint flush touched her cheeks. You were injured. I know. You were stubborn. I know. You ignored perfectly sensible advice. I know. He smiled warmly. And you reminded me of it every morning. Something in Marianne's expression began to soften, only slightly. But, she said quietly, you still deceived me. Julian nodded once. I did. And for that, I owe you an apology. Not an excuse, an apology. He stepped closer. I am sorry. I should have trusted you sooner. I simply, he gave the smallest shake of his head, kept waiting for one more day, and then another, and another, until eventually there was no easy moment left. Before Marianne could answer, another voice interrupted. Reginald Ashby. This is absurd. Everyone turned. Ashby had entered moments earlier, drawn to news of the solicitor's arrival. His face had gone pale, then red, then pale again. He looked at Julian in disbelief. You expect anyone to believe this ridiculous story. Julian faced him calmly. I don't require belief. I require facts. You've been pretending to be a servant. I have. For weeks. I have. Ashby laughed sharply. Convenient. Julian remained perfectly composed. I've inspected every account personally. I've spoken with tenants, I've worked beside the staff, I've reviewed the ledgers, and I can state without reservation, he glanced toward Edgar, that Mr. Coe has served this estate with complete integrity. Ashby's expression hardened. The delays, wages, repairs, were caused by London, not by him. Ashby folded his arms. And the inheritance? Julian looked almost bored by the question. The entail is valid. My solicitors have reviewed it thoroughly. They're prepared to defend it in court as often as necessary.
Mr. Hollis quietly opened his portfolio. "I have the documents here." Ashby's confidence faltered. Julian continued, "If you choose to proceed, you'll spend a great deal of money and lose." The room became silent once more. Ashby looked around. No one supported him. Not the steward, not the solicitor, not even the servants standing quietly near the door. He realized his audience had disappeared. With obvious reluctance, he straightened his coat. "I shall review matters with my own solicitors." "I encourage it," Julian answered evenly. "They'll reach the same conclusion." Ashby said nothing else. He turned sharply and walked out. The heavy drawing-room doors closed behind him. The sound echoed through the house, and with it, weeks of tension seemed to disappear all at once. Edgar Coe finally released a long breath. "I believe," he managed with a weary smile, "that may be the first peaceful moment this estate has enjoyed in months." Julian smiled warmly. "I suspect you're right." The older man looked toward his daughter, then toward Julian. "I should leave the two of you." Marianne looked startled. "Father!" "I think," he smiled knowingly, "there are rather a great many things still left unsaid." Without another word, Edgar quietly followed the solicitor from the room. The doors closed once again, leaving only two people inside. One who had spent 2 weeks pretending to be someone he wasn't. The other trying to decide whether she had been speaking to a stranger or whether the man she'd come to know had actually been real all along. If you think Marianne has every right to be upset, but also understand why Julian hid the truth, comment Jack or Julian below. And don't forget to subscribe, because in the final part, Julian risks everything with one heartfelt confession, and Marianne must decide whether she fell in love with an earl or simply with the man who once sat obediently on a mounting block while she scolded him about his shoulder. The drawing room remained quiet long after everyone else had gone. Neither of them seemed eager to break the silence. Outside, somewhere beyond the tall windows, the estate carried on exactly as it always had. A groom led horses across the yard. A cart rattled over the gravel drive. Someone laughed faintly near the kitchens. Life hadn't paused simply because the truth had finally come into the open. Yet for Marianne, everything felt different. She looked at Julian for what felt like the 100th time that afternoon. The strange thing was, he hadn't changed, not really. He was still the man who rose before dawn. He was still the man who never frightened nervous horses. He was still the man who insisted he was perfectly capable of lifting feed sacks he had no business touching. Still the man she laughed with in the tack room while rain drummed softly against the roof. Only now she knew his name, his title, his world. And somehow that knowledge complicated everything. Julian broke the silence first. "I imagine you have questions." Marianne gave a quiet laugh. "I've had nothing but questions for the last quarter of an hour." "I'll answer every one of them." She looked at him carefully. Truthfully?
He didn't hesitate. Truthfully. Another pause settled between them. Then she asked the question that mattered most. When did you stop pretending? Julian frowned slightly. I'm not certain I understand. I don't mean when you revealed yourself. She shook her head. I mean, she searched for the words, when did Jack Pell stop being an act? His expression softened. Earlier than I intended. How much earlier? He smiled faintly. The morning you took the saddle away from me. She blinked. That early? I expected people to treat me cautiously, respectfully, perhaps nervously. I did not expect a steward's daughter to tell me I was behaving like a fool. Despite everything, she smiled. You were. I know. I especially liked the comparison to an injured horse. I still maintain it was accurate. It was. He laughed quietly. And that's precisely the problem. What problem? No one else would have dared say it. Marianne folded her arms. They should have. They should have. He agreed immediately. Instead, I've spent years surrounded by people who nodded politely, even when I was making dreadful decisions. She looked at him thoughtfully. That sounds lonely. Julian considered the word, then nodded. It was. They left the drawing room together. No ceremony, no announcement. Just two people walking through familiar corridors that somehow felt unfamiliar now. As they stepped outside, the cool afternoon air greeted them. The stable yard looked exactly as it always had. Mud, hay, working horses, stable boys hurrying from one task to another. One young groom noticed Julian. For a brief instant, he looked uncertain whether to bow. Julian simply smiled. Carry on. The boy nodded awkwardly before disappearing into the barn. Marianne noticed. So, she said, I suppose everyone will begin treating you differently now. I hope not. You will. I know. She looked toward the stables. So will I. He stopped walking. You don't have to. She met his eyes. I think I do. Why? Because I can't exactly order an earl onto a mounting block. His grin appeared almost instantly. I sincerely hope you can. She laughed. I don't think society would approve. I've spent the last fortnight discovering that society approves of a great many foolish things and disapproves of several sensible ones. I'd rather keep the sensible ones. For the first time since the revelation, the awkwardness eased, not entirely, but enough. Enough for both of them to breathe again. The following week transformed Thistledown Park. News spread astonishingly fast. By the second morning, every servant knew. By the third, every tenant. By week's end, half the neighboring county had heard the extraordinary story of the Earl who had disguised himself as his own stable hand. Opinions varied. Some admired him. Some questioned his judgment. Others simply enjoyed repeating the tale. Julian ignored every version. He had more important matters to attend to. The first order of business was wages. Every overdue payment was released immediately. Repairs that had waited for months finally began. Tenant disputes were settled personally. Julian insisted on visiting every farm himself, not because anyone expected it, because now he genuinely wanted to know the people whose lives depended upon the estate. Edgar Coe accompanied him often, not as a servant, as an advisor. Julian had learned during those 2 weeks just how valuable the steward really was.
One afternoon, after returning from a neighboring farm, he found Edgar reviewing ledgers in the estate office. The older man stood respectfully as Julian entered. "My lord." Julian smiled. "If we're alone, I wish you'd continue calling me Julian." The steward looked uncertain. "I'm not sure that's appropriate." "I am." The steward hesitated only briefly, then nodded. "Very well. Julian." He smiled. "I've spent years trying to understand estates through paperwork," Julian said quietly. "It took pretending to be a stable hand to teach me what those papers never could." Edgar chuckled. "I imagine that's not something they teach future earls. No, they teach quite a great many other things, but not that." He became serious again. "I owe you thanks. You held this place together. You protected it. You protected everyone here." Edgar looked genuinely uncomfortable receiving praise. "I merely did my duty." "I know," Julian answered warmly, "which is precisely why you deserve it." Reginald Ashby left Thistledown Park before the week ended. His solicitors had reviewed the entail. Every argument he'd hoped to make collapsed under proper examination. The inheritance was lawful. The challenge had no future. His departure was quiet. No dramatic farewell. No final confrontation. One rainy morning, his carriage simply rolled away from the house. Several servants watched discreetly from upstairs windows. One stable boy even waved. Ashby did not wave back. Marianne happened to see the carriage disappear beyond the gates. She felt no satisfaction, only relief. The estate had been waiting months to breathe freely again. Now, finally, it could. Yet one matter remained unsettled. One evening, nearly a week after Ashby's departure, Julian found Marianne exactly where he'd hoped he would, the stable yard, the same place where everything had begun. She stood beside the tall carriage horse he'd first struggled to saddle. The horse lifted its head as Julian approached. "I believe," he said quietly, "he still remembers embarrassing me." Marianne smiled without turning. "I imagine he remembers someone trying to work with an injured shoulder. That too." She looked at him then. "You've been busy." "So have you." "I've always been busy," Marianne answered. "I don't imagine being countess would change that." The word slipped out almost absent-mindedly. Countess. They both heard it. Silence followed. Julian stepped closer. "I've been trying to say something." She waited. "I've rehearsed it several times. That's unlike you." "I know. I've become unexpectedly nervous." She folded her arms lightly. "Go on." He drew one slow breath. "When I came here, I intended only to inspect an estate. I know. I expected to stay a week. I know. I certainly didn't expect to meet anyone." She smiled faintly. "Neither did I. I thought pretending to be someone else would help me understand this place. It did." He looked around the stable, but somewhere along the way, I stopped pretending. His voice grew quieter. "I became happier here than I'd been anywhere in years. I laughed. I worked. I slept peacefully. I discovered what ordinary life felt like." Then he looked directly into her eyes. "And I discovered you." Marianne's heartbeat quickened. "You challenged me. You argued with me. You refused to admire me for reasons that had nothing to do with who I actually was. You cared whether I healed, whether I rested, whether I behaved sensibly." A warm smile crossed his face. "No one has cared for me quite like that." She looked down briefly. "I was only trying to help." "I know. That's exactly why it mattered." Another long pause. The stable seemed unusually quiet. Even the horses stood peacefully behind them. Finally, Julian spoke again. "I don't wish to return to the life I had before." She looked back at him. "I don't wish to spend the rest of my years surrounded by people impressed only by a title. I want someone willing to tell me when I'm wrong. Someone who'll stop me carrying saddles with an injured shoulder." She laughed softly. "I suspect you'll continue trying." "Almost certainly." "Then I'll continue stopping you." "I hoped you might." He smiled. "Julian," his voice became almost tentative, "would you consider doing that for the rest of our lives?" She stared at him. The question hung gently between them, not rushed, not dramatic, simply honest. He wasn't asking because she'd impressed society or because she'd fit neatly into his world. He was asking because she'd spoken to him honestly when he believed he had absolutely nothing to offer. And somehow that mattered more than anything else. She smiled, slowly, warmly. "You know," she said, "I've spent the last week wondering whether I cared about Jack Pell or the Earl of Ravensworth." He waited. "I finally realized something." "What?" "They're the same man." His shoulders relaxed. "I was beginning to hope you'd say that." She stepped a little closer. "I don't particularly care what title you inherited. I care that you remember to rest when you're injured. I care that you don't overwork yourself. I care that you continue listening. And," she smiled mischievously, "I reserve the right to scold you whenever necessary." Julian laughed. "I wouldn't dream of taking that right away." "So," she asked quietly, "is that a proposal?" "It very much is." She didn't make him wait. "Yes." Just one word. Simple. Certain. "Yes." Julian smiled with the kind of happiness that reached every corner of his face. For the first time in many months, the future felt wonderfully uncomplicated. They were married the following spring, not in London, not surrounded by endless aristocratic ceremony, but in the small parish church nearest Thistledown Park, exactly where Marianne wanted. The entire household attended. Stable boys scrubbed themselves spotless for the occasion. Tenant families filled every pew. Edgar Coe stood proudly beside his daughter, looking happier than anyone had seen in years. After the ceremony, the celebration spilled across the estate grounds. There were long tables beneath white tents. Children ran through the fields laughing. The kitchen staff insisted everyone eat far too much. Even the horses received extra apples that afternoon. Julian wouldn't have changed a single thing. Edgar remained steward of Thistledown Park, not because Julian needed him, but because Julian trusted him completely. Together they restored the estate. Repairs were completed. Tenants prospered. The household became known throughout the county as one of the happiest and fairest places to work. As for Marianne, she never abandoned the stables. Even after becoming countess, she still appeared most mornings with her sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows, inspecting horses, checking tack, occasionally reminding new stable hands that stubbornness was not the same as strength. Julian kept one small memento hidden inside the drawer of his study desk, the old strip of linen she'd wrapped around his injured shoulder each morning. To anyone else, it was just a worn piece of cloth. To him, it was the reminder of the fortnight that had changed everything. Years later, visitors sometimes asked how the Earl of Ravensworth had come to marry his steward's daughter. Marianne always smiled before answering. "Oh," she would say, "it began because one exceedingly stubborn stable hand thought he could work through a shoulder injury, and I simply refused to let him." Julian would laugh every single time, because after all those years, she still scolded him, and he still listened. If this ending made you smile, don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt Regency romances every week. And tell me in the comments, when did you realize Jack Pell wasn't really a stable hand? Was it the way he spoke, the way he handled the horses, or did the drawing room reveal catch you completely by surprise?